In today's show, we got season previews back in action. We're talking Jerami Grant. Is he the platonic ideal of a role player for the Blazers? Or is he miscast as a player who thinks he's a star but not ready to accept a smaller role in Portland? Welcome to Locked On Blazers. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Trailblazers, your daily Portland Trailblazers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, world? It's your past first point guard and Trailblazers reporter, Mike Richmond. You are listening to another episode of Locked On Blazers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, available wherever you get podcasts and also on YouTube. Why don't you make this show your first listen every single day? 5 days a week. We're back. Your only daily Trailblazers podcast. We're doing this for the next 6 months, 5 days a week. Join us every single day. Tell your friends to do the same. Every single weekday, that is. I do take some weekends off every now and then. We got a fun show for you today. We're rolling along with season previews. Today's episode, the 8th installment of the Locked On Blazers countdown to tip-off, running down every player on the roster and giving you a brief but thorough look at what they'll bring to the Blazers. We'll look at how they performed last season, how they wound up on the Blazers, talk best and worst case scenarios, and then we'll finish the show talking expectations and likely role for the upcoming year. This is the 8th installment, the 8th one of these that we've done. It's the 9th player that we've profiled. So if you've missed any of the others, waiting in your feed and organized on YouTube in a playlist called Season Previews, you can check them all out. Don't miss them. We're going to do every player on the roster, but if you're just jumping in because it's media day and you're new to the podcast or whatever it is, we got them all. It's a great way to get prepped for the season, or if you just want to see where I stand on some of your favorite players in the roster, a great kind of jumping off point, I think, for new to the podcast or restarting the season or whatever it might be. I like these season previews. I think you will too. Today, we're returning home, talking Jerami Grant. How did Grant fare last season and get here? Let's talk about it. Jerami Grant appeared in 47 games, all starts for the Detroit Pistons last season, playing 31.9 minutes a night. He averaged 19, 4, and 2.5, or 19.2, 4.1 rebounds, and 2.4 assists to go along with just shy of 1 steal, 0.9 steals, and 1.0 blocks per game. Shot 42.6% from the floor, 35.8% from the three-point line, and 83.8% from the free throw stripe. It was his second season in Detroit. And after he had clearly been very good, averaging a career high in points, a career high in assists, and looking like, borderline all-star in his first season in Detroit, his second season took a turn when on December 21st, he tore ligaments in his left thumb and missed the following 24 games. When Grant went out of the lineup, he was the guy. On a young Pistons team with, a second-year players, and Isaiah Stewart and Saddiq Bey still trying to find their footing. The first overall pick, Cade Cunningham, who quite frankly was bad at the beginning of the year as he got acclimated to the league. But when Jerami Grant returned to the lineup in February 1st, he comes back and starts playing again. Cade Cunningham had found his footing. He really took off shortly thereafter, but he was much better than he had been. And Saddiq Bey had kind of solidified himself as a guy you can run offense through. They had found a rhythm with it. And Grant, to his credit, played more of a complimentary type role down the stretch and looked pretty good doing it than he had as a featured role where he was getting some heat for maybe being inefficient, taking some bad jump shots, hijacking an offense away from a young and up-and-coming team occasionally. But even in that complimentary role, he was still getting buckets from time to time. He had some big 20-point games. He had 40 at Cleveland on March 19th. And then 2 days later, 40 piece at Cleveland. 2 days later, takes the night off. Blazers play the Pistons. And there had been so much trade chatter surrounding Jerami Grant heading into the trade deadline, and the Blazers were rumored to be one of the teams hot after him. In fact, the team most actively pursuing him at the trade deadline. A deal doesn't come around. It doesn't work out. The Blazers make some other trades, 2 other major trades, and some minor ones in there in conjunction with the major trades, but they don't land Jerami Grant. They land the assets that would later become Jerami Grant, but they don't land Jerami Grant. But it is known that he is coveted here in the Rose City. And so after the game, after the Blazers and the Pistons play one another and the Blazers win a game, one of the very few, too, they won down the stretch, Jerami Grant spends a small portion of his post-game covering his mouth and whispering with Josh Hart and Yusuf Nurkic. Tampering season. A now infamous photograph that was shared when the Blazers later acquired Jerami Grant. It was the banner photo they used in the press release. Tampering season. But just 4 days after that, on March 25th, against the Washington Wizards, Jerami Grant sustained a calf strain. Just played about 7.5 minutes left in the first quarter and left the game early. They ruled him out right away, and he did not return. His season ended that night at the end of March. He heads in averaging 19, 4, and 2.5. Didn't shoot as well as he had the previous season, but another darn good year, Jerami Grant in the books. But it's clear that he is a short timer in Detroit. They tried to trade him at the trade deadline. He's had 1 year remaining on his contract. And so it is clear that Grant is likely to find a new home. And then prior to the NBA draft in late June, the Blazers got that deal done. The Portland Trail Blazers had acquired a first-round pick from the New Orleans Pelicans in the CJ trade, and they sent that, a 2025 pick that initially belonged to the Bucks, to the Detroit Pistons, along with 2 second-round picks in 2025 and 2026 for Jerami Grant, and a second-rounder in 2022 that eventually got rerouted, and we don't need to follow that. But a first and 2 picks for Jerami, and 2 second-rounders for Jerami Grant. And now he's coming back, entering his 9th NBA season. The former second-round pick is back in the town where he was born. The son of former Blazer Harvey Grant, who didn't spend much time here. He was very young when he left, but back in the town he was born, a full circle moment for the team that had been rumored to be pursuing him for months. Grant finally comes to Portland. So what's it going to look like now that he's in Portland and in a contract year and eligible potentially for a contract extension in Portland? Let's talk about what it might look like in the second segment. We do best and worst case scenarios here, talking about what's the best case Jerami Grant look like and what does the worst case Jerami Grant look like. That's what we'll do in the second segment. But first, let me tell you about BetOnline, the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your sports action. That's BetOnline. More lines, more props, more odds than anywhere else. You want to bet on the NFL, you want to bet on college football, you want to spend your weekends wagering on gridiron games, you're going to find all those lines and props and odds at BetOnline for every game going on Saturdays and Sundays. Not a football person? Fine. You can bet on NBA futures, NHL futures. You can bet on soccer here and abroad. You can bet on combat sports. You can bet on tennis. You can bet on golf. Whatever you're looking for, you're going to find it on BetOnline. So why not go take advantage today? That's BetOnline, where the game starts. All right. Let's keep it rolling. Talking best case, worst case scenarios for Jerami Grant. A caveat, as we always do to begin this segment. We do the player previews are structured all the same, but I like to give this caveat at the beginning of the second segment regardless. These are best case scenario within reason, based on your likely role on the team and your coworkers and all of those things, and without injury. Everyone's worst case scenario is their body breaks down. We're talking about worst case scenario if you're on the court and playing. So what's the best case scenario for Jerami Grant? It's that he's the Blazers' second best player. He's the two-way forward they've been looking for years, and the friendship he formed with Damian Lillard on Team USA, and they continued beyond that. The payoff is that he fits. He's the guy. He's a secondary scorer who can bring it on offense and a really versatile defender on defense who can guard threes, who can guard fours, who can sneak and guard fives, who's long enough to bother guards, and who is the two-way forward they have long coveted. The best case scenario is that he's a competent role player on offense, but he has enough offensive pop to be so much more when called upon. The problem with Blazers forwards of the past is that they were one thing or another. They were, a pretty darn good offensive player like Rodney Hood, or they were a pretty darn good defensive player like Al-Farouq Aminu, but rarely both at the same time. You never got someone who was an above average offensive player and above average defensive player, someone who could go create their own shot, someone who could go, get their own offense on one end and guard the best player on the other team on the other end. The Blazers have not had that forward. Even LaMarcus at his peak wasn't the type of versatile defender. He's a much better offensive player and is probably just a better overall defensive player. But in terms of one-on-one guarding the ball, it's been a while since the Blazers have had someone like Jerami Grant. A listener likened it to the acquisition of Gerald Wallace, which I think is a really good one. A two-way forward that brings athleticism and is thought to prop up both the defense and the offense with some individual offensive skills and some defensive versatility. Wallace and Jerami Grant aren't particularly similar players in their style of play, but the acquisition reads to me as very, very similar reasoning from the Blazers front office, albeit nearly 10 years apart. The best case scenario is that Jerami Grant is the thing they've been looking for. He's Portland's second best player. And why I mean that is the best case scenario is because if Jerami Grant is clearly their second best player, it means that he's a good defender and a really good offensive player, and that the value he brings on defense outweighs what Anthony Simons would bring on the other end, right? And Ant might be a step or so ahead of him offensively, but Grant's balance on both ends of the floor makes him so clearly the Blazers' second best player. And there's real value in that, and he sees a long-term future in Portland. It is a happy first impression that leads to a long-term future, and not because the Blazers have sort of opportunity cost back their way into having to sign Jerami Grant, but because it works. The best case scenario is that the trade for CJ McCollum brings you a Josh Hart and a Jerami Grant, and both veterans are versatile parts of the future, and moving on from one era of the Blazers seems so much easier because of what you got back in return. But there's always another side. And the worst case scenario for Jerami Grant is that he just thinks he's the Blazers' second best player. He just thinks he's the Blazers' second best player. In reality, he's something short of that. He came off 2 seasons in Detroit where he had a usage rate of 26.9 and then 24.5. Typical usage for players is like in his role would be something like 20. For like a low minutes, not your best player on the team type of guy. It's about 20 is normal for like sort of typical median range usage players. In his prior 6 seasons in the NBA, Jerami Grant had never had a usage higher than 17. He was a complementary part, a role player, and a play finisher. He caught the ball and he shot it. He caught the ball and he dunked it. He didn't do a lot else. He took big steps as a playmaker in Detroit, particularly in his first season with the Pistons, where he was like a straight up pretty good fulcrum, pretty good, had some inefficiencies on offense, but really was probably better than most people thought he could be by stepping into that bigger role. And the worst case scenario is that Grant cannot see himself taking what would amount to a step back from featured part of an offense in Detroit to complementary part in Portland. And why I say the worst case scenario is that he just thinks he's their best player is because the worst case scenario is that while Grant is clearly not as good as Anthony Simons or clearly not as good as Yusuf Nurkic on, opposite ends of the court, offense and defense there, is that he still fancies himself as that. So he hijacks the offense a little bit more than you would like, and with a reduced role on offense, he eventually doesn't have the same buy-in to the defensive first ask. He's less impactful on offense, then he has less of a role on offense, then he brings it a little less on defense. It all feeds into itself. And the worst case scenario is that Grant is a short timer. By the time you get to the trade deadline, you are looking to send Jerami Grant to another place because he's not the answer. He's the bridge to what's next. And that the moving on from the CJ McCollum, Damian Lillard era isn't as smooth because now it's hit a real rocky start where you are trading, it's not a direct trade for him, but you get a first round pick and you acquire Jerami Grant in kind of the end of the completion of the CJ trade in some ways. And the worst case scenario is that you're still kind of playing out the string and figuring out what's next by the time you get to February. I would say talking with Jerami Grant, and this is the first one of these previews I've done since Media Day. All the other ones were prior to Media Day. I had listened to Grant's interviews when he was introduced, but I did not attend that press conference. And there's a very big difference, for me at least. You can kind of just get a better sense, read body language and body cues like that in person, better than I can even watching the press conference. I got a little bit of it in his first press conference, introductory press conference. I really got it again on Media Day. I don't think Jerami Grant likes talking about his role and his positions very much because I think of someone like Jerami Grant, who was a second-round pick who toiled on a terrible 14-win Sixers team in his first year in the league, found a way to stick in the NBA, earned himself a very solid reputation in OKC, was traded for a first-round pick to be part of a a quality core with a team that made the Western Conference Finals in Denver and then left to be the man and get a big contract in Detroit. Someone who followed that path, made his dreams a reality, doesn't want to talk about doing less and having less on his plate, which seems real and reasonable to me. Grant wants to, when asked, can you play this position? Can you play that position? Instead of wanting to talk about what he can do, Jerami Grant just says plainly, I can play all over the court. I'm fine. When asked about the sort of change from, star to role player, Grant says, I can play. I'll be ready to play. He is not interested in discussing a reduced role in the way that no one would be in a new job. Hey, I came here to take a step back is not an enticing conversation for anyone to have. That can be read two ways. And I think the way you read it speaks to whether you think where the pendulum swings for Jerami Grant, best case or worst case scenario. The one way is to say, of course he doesn't want to talk about it. He just wants to hoop. The dude's a basketball player. That's the best case scenario. And I think that's a totally fair read. The other way is that Grant is still wrestling with the fact that people think it didn't work, or the perception of him is that he wasn't able to take the step forward he did, even though he averaged 22, 8, and 3 in a season in Detroit. How many dudes could do that? How many, he envisions himself as something, as something akin to a borderline all-star. So when you ask him, how's it going to be Dame's guy, like Dame's little buddy? I mean, that's not really the implication, but the implication is, how does it feel to be, you're going to be a role player now? What's your interest in that? Is that he says, I'm better than that, and you're miscasting me, or you don't understand what I bring, or all of these things. And that makes me think that the pendulum could swing to the worst case scenario, because understanding, appreciating, and accepting your role is kind of, it's the hardest job in some ways a coach has, right? It's the soft stuff of getting guys to buy in. And I think that's one of my concerns with Jerami Grant. So let's talk about the realistic role and expectations, because we set the polls here, best and worst, and then we try to figure out where in the middle Jerami Grant will land, or any of these players will land. So join me in the third segment. Let's talk about where Jerami Grant's going to land and what his first season in Portland is going to look like. Still a pass first point guard. I'm still Mike Richmond. You are still listening to Locked On Blazers. What's a realistic role, and what are our expectations for Jerami Grant here in Portland in his first season with the Trailblazers? Just as a reminder, the best case and worst case scenarios are not meant to be it's going to be this or this. It's meant to set the edges, and then everybody lands in the middle. And what we try to do to close the show is figure out what the middle looks like. The role is pretty easy for Grant. He's going to start at power forward. That's a done deal. But I think a note that I would add about his role is, I bet he plays a lot more minutes at center this season than he does at small forward. Just because of the way the roster works. You look at his colleagues. The area for him to play a position out of where he starts is much likely playing center than it is sliding to the 3. It's just a reality of the roster for now. The roster might change. If it changes, this part gets a big asterisk. But as it looks here in September, I think Grant is much more likely to play, more minutes as a center than he does as a small forward. The distinction between small forward and power forward is not super meaningful, but if Josh Hart is on the court as the 3, Jerami Grant's clearly the 4. If Nazir Little's on the court as a 3, it's less meaningful, but if it's Hart or Gary Payton or even Shaedon Sharpe, Grant's the 4, to be clear, and who you guard and who guards you is probably the best way to judge what position you play, particularly who you are capable of guarding. That's is more so than are you taller than the other guy on the court? Positions increasingly mean nothing in the league, but I think the distinction I'm making here is Grant much likely to be tallest dude asked to guard the tallest dude than he will be, the 3 next to 2 people who are clearly bigger and asked to guard people bigger than him in the lineup. I also believe that Jerami Grant is the biggest swing player on the Blazers roster. If he's good, man, are they going to have a chance to be good? If Grant is a significantly above average defender, if he is, in addition to being a significantly above average defender, right at sort of what he's been as kind of like a slightly below to slightly above offensive player. When he had a smaller role, he was a very efficient scorer. As it's typical when players, take on more load, he was just, when he was asked to do more stuff on offense, he was not nearly as efficient. It's normal. Not everyone can scale up. That's what the difference in stars and role players are. Grant was much less efficient scoring, particularly on twos, because he liked to take a lot of long 2-pointers in Detroit, than he was when he was like a just dunk and space to shoot threes in Oklahoma City and Denver his previous 2 seasons prior to landing with the Pistons. The platonic ideal of Jerami Grant is that role player that was so good in OKC, like the length that he gave OKC, where he played small forward and crazy small ball center with his length. And then in Denver, or in a playoff series where they made the Western Conference Finals, he guarded Donovan Mitchell, Kawhi Leonard, and LeBron James. When the Stars came to town, Denver said, "Jerami, we need you to go check them." And, sort of judging how well you guard stars, like the Stars stats, is not a particularly meaningful way to maybe judge defensive performance. But I will say this: the ask is more important. You guard Donovan Mitchell in the first round. Cool. We need you again. You're guarding Kawhi Leonard. And cool, we need you again. You're guarding LeBron James. He got the ask every time. That's the platonic ideal of Jerami Grant, is that, right? Low usage, like a usage in the, 16 range. That's how many possessions you finish with either a shot, a turnover, or a free throw. Basically, how many possessions you finish for your team. That's what usage rate is measuring. So like a usage rate right in that 17 range, where he's an efficient, 38% 3-point shooter and able to guard the best players on the team and averages something like 17 a game. That would be a scaled up version of what his role was in Denver. I think he's going to want more than that, but I don't think there's a lot more than that available. I think like 31, 32 minutes a night for Jerami Grant, 17 points per game, 16, 17 points per game is a very realistic role. The judge for me of whether he's closer to the best case scenario, closer to the worst case scenario, is what he does on the defensive end. And whether when he does get his offense, he's like forces a little bit too much. I think this is an unfair comparison because I think Jerami Grant's just better than late career Carmelo Anthony, but it reminds me a little bit of when Melo was here, and there was some deference to Melo, and so the Blazers let him soak up some possessions where he just took terrible shots and it was a mess. There was a little part of Jerami Grant that wants to take isolation 19-footers. Like I watched the Pistons a bunch last year. I watched Jerami Grant take a bunch of isolation, 2-dribble, pull-up 19-footers. There's a little Melo in there for him. The worst case scenario is that he does too much of that and not enough of just like, he doesn't need to be only a 3-and-D guy, but he needs to pick his spots more because the Blazers have elite offensive players in Damian Lillard and what I believe Anthony Simons can be. More of them, and then when Grant, if you get him in that some second unit minutes where he's like playing against second unit guys on a team that's going to play faster with like Josh Hart and GP out there, yeah, I think you can get the most out of Grant. But my worry for worst case scenario is just like too much bad offense from Grant and not enough high level defense. Again, he doesn't need to be a 3-and-D guy, but he needs to be a defensive first player for me to feel like he's hitting his best towards his best case scenario. I kind of think he's going to be fine. I don't think he's going to be the answer. Like, I don't think he's going to just like crush past that best case scenario and make me look silly. Because I think there's like in some ways a limit to what he can do. But like, I think he's going to be pretty good. Like 17 and 5 boards with an assist and a half is going to be a pretty good season for Jerami Grant. I think he's going to be fine. Whether he pushes the Blazers into sort of like an above average defense and whether he allows them to run a really good offense when he's on the court, we'll see. And I think that will be the judge for me. But his counting numbers, I'm not too worried about Jerami Grant. We got more fun shows for you tomorrow, or more fun shows for you this week, including tomorrow's show where Orlando Sanchez, a reporter from KGW here in Portland, is going to join the show. First-time guest on the program. Super excited to have him. Come back for that one. Come back for Friday when we'll talk the first week of training camp for the Blazers. Next week, we'll continue to do our player previews. We got some preseason games next Monday, 5 days a week, wherever you get podcasts. Make this your first listen every single day, and then make your second listen Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Josh Lloyd is doing a great job. He's the best there is in the game at getting you better at fantasy basketball. Go listen to Locked On Fantasy Basketball. If you're a fantasy basketball player, you will win because you listen to Josh. Even if you're not into fantasy hoops, Josh is just a wealth of NBA knowledge that will make you smarter if you listen to him. So check it out. That's available wherever you get podcasts and also on YouTube. I appreciate you listening. I'll talk to you soon.